Now, an addiction or involvement in a life of drug abuse can be debilitating, derailing, depressing to that individual, but also to those around them, close friends and family who are caught up in the chaos. Figures from the latest Health Research Board show that the use of more than one substance was reported by 25% of those surveyed, with cocaine now being the most common additional drug being used. So when it comes to the war on drugs, do we need to change our attitudes towards drug users? How can we win the war, or has that war already been lost? Joining me now is Dr. Austin O'Carroll, a GP who specialises in drug and homeless services. Austin, good morning and welcome.
Good morning, Pat. Thank you very much for asking me in.
Now, the question of the war on drugs, a victory would mean no cocaine, no heroin, no cannabis getting through the net that surrounds the country, and very few people managing to procure supplies to use them. So we just fall back on alcohol.
Yeah. I mean, the war on drugs was started by President Reagan, and its origins are not particularly, beneficial to people. And I mean, it's been going since the 70s. If you talk about it as a war on drugs, it sounds fantastic, but as a war, it has failed. There are still as many drugs on the street. We see them on the street. So this idea that you have a battle and you fight drugs actually takes away attention from what we should be doing. What we should be doing is, rather than trying we should still try and stop the supply, but the real way to deal with drug addiction is to provide healthcare interventions, to provide support people who use drugs. And this means that rather than focusing on the criminal justice system, we should focus on the health system.
Now, we were using methadone substitution for heroin. Some people say that's just substituting one addictive substance for another. But that is a health intervention rather than a judicial intervention.
Yeah, and people get confused about this. Yes, you are substituting one addictive substance for another. However, heroin is an addictive substance that causes you to die from overdose, causes you to get HIV, hepatitis, causes you to fall out of your family, causes you to end up in crime, causes you to lose your job, become homeless and fall out of society. Methadone, yes, I would prefer not to be on it. However, you don't die from methadone. You don't end up in crime. You don't end up getting HIV or hepatitis. And you can reconnect with your family. So I have people coming into me. I work in homeless services, and we have many people who come in who are on the streets using drugs. Within 3 months of us starting people on opiate substitution treatment, which is methadone or Suboxone, they are back. Their accommodation has improved. A lot of them have come off the streets, or they've got back to their own home place. And most of them reconnect with their family, and they start on a progress towards rehabilitation. So even though they are two addictions, they are totally different types of addictions. People get moral about addiction. It's not the addiction that's the problem. It's the effects of the addiction. I'm addicted to exercise, but it has good effects for me. So yes, if you're on methadone, you can be addicted to it, but it gets you away. Now, eventually, I try and help people off methadone so that they can end rehabilitation. And if they're ready to come off, we support them to come off it as well.
The question of decriminalisation, and there's often a confusion thing. It's not about legalising all sorts of substances. So explain the nuance.
So decriminalisation is when a person is found in possession of drugs for personal use. And 70% of drug offences are people in possession for personal use. Rather than send them to the criminal justice system, you send them for a health intervention, which means they have to go to try and come off drugs and get their health together and get their lives together. If they refuse to take that health intervention, then they go back to the criminal justice system. But you offer them that first, and the vast majority of people take it. However, if you're found in possession of drugs for supply, in other words, you're a seller or a dealer, you go to the criminal justice system. So it's purely for those people who are in possession of drugs, they're not dealing. It's rather than put them into prison where their drug use will probably worsen and their social problems worsen, it's to get them into a health intervention. It's much more human and it's much more effective. It's been found, for example, in Portugal, that people who do this, they're much more likely to rehabilitate. They are much less drug death use as a result of this, much less likely to get HIV or hepatitis, and much more likely to regain in employment.
There will be the counter-argument, I suppose, that someone who knows that they will not go to prison if they're found in possession of a small quantity of any of these substances, whatever they may be, well, sure, what's the harm? I'll buy some of this stuff and, I'll use it regularly if I want to. In other words, it becomes a gateway to potential addiction and abuse?
Well, again, the evidence internationally shows that the use of drugs doesn't increase. I mean, there's slight variations in different countries. Some go slightly up, some go slightly down. But what's really interesting is the hard drugs, such as heroin, they go down. The opiate use goes down. So the significant drugs that cause death go down. It doesn't affect drug use amongst the others in terms of you don't have an increase in drug use. But you still have all these positive outcomes. It absolutely makes sense when you look at the evidence to go for decriminalisation.
How difficult might that be in terms of Dáil Éireann?
When in fact we are already partially there, because at present they have a system whereby if you are found in possession of drugs on the first occasion, you're sent for health intervention. So we're already there. It just means that rather than on your second or third that you go to the criminal justice system, we extend that each time you go to the health system. And if you refuse to go to the health system, then yes, you're diverted back to the...
Okay, now you are effectively advocating the fire brigade and the ambulance service for those people who need them. In other words, the health interventions for the addicts and those caught with substances. How to prevent them in the first place? I mean, when you've got young kids who are acting as couriers for the big guys, so the big guys never get caught with their hands dirty, without that supply, and particularly for people who are not yet addicted, who have a habit but it's not as destructive as it might yet become. How do you disrupt that supply? How do you stop the kids from doing this, who they themselves may become addicted anyway?
First of all, you still work on stopping supply. You keep at it. It won't stop it getting in. We know that. It continuously gets in. But if you really want to stop drug use, you look at poverty. I mean, I go into a group of medical students and I say, 300 medical students. I'll ask, how many of you know someone who uses hard drugs, such as heroin or crack cocaine? You might have found 3 or 4 people put up. I say, how many do you know someone who's died of using drugs, overdose? And you might have 1, maybe none. You go into a classroom in inner city Dublin of 8-year-olds and you ask those same questions, and practically all of them will put their hands up to both questions. It was shocking for me. I was actually talking to Imelda about this because she comes from the Liberties before, and we're sitting outside. And she talked about back in the 80s how her community was destroyed and how many people died. I know one friend of mine who had a class of 13, and of those class of 13, there's only 3 alive. I met families when I first went in there who had lost 3 or 4 people from drugs. It's a problem of people in poverty. Yes, there is the occasional person outside of poverty who falls, but if it is those communities. So if you really want to look at prevention, you start looking at these communities. And the second issue is you look at trauma, because often many people who use drugs, there's actually, I heard recently someone say, it was actually the guy who, the Scottish writer, who wrote the great film on drugs. I've just blanked on it. But he said that, everyone can end up on drugs, he says, but it's the people who stay on drugs. And often they're the people who've experienced trauma. And I believe this is what nowadays we believe people are using that drugs to actually self-medicate for the effects.
You're talking about Trainspotting, the movie, I presume. Yeah,
that's right. Yeah.
And the trauma that you say comes from maybe poverty, but within communities, as Imelda was saying actually earlier, there are very strong people in communities.
Yeah.
And many of them have tried to resist the influence of the drug peddlers and have failed. So what is it about those communities that make them vulnerable to substance abuse? I mean, the substance abuse of the rich may well be vodka and wine.
Yeah.
Do you know?
Well, I mean, it's really obvious. You get powder cocaine amongst the rich, you get crack cocaine amongst the people in poverty. It's a real classic divide. And it's literally because people, they're falling out of education, they're falling out of employment, they don't have any sense of hope. And therefore, families become under huge pressure. They end up a lot of dysfunctional families. That causes children to end up being exposed to trauma. And I honestly believe, I see this every day, people coming in who are out of control, and you can see it's because they're angry because it comes from childhood. And when you ask their stories, their stories are phenomenally difficult. And so the vast majority of people I'm working with who are using hard drugs, not the soft drugs, the hard drugs, I believe are self-medicating to manage the effects of that trauma.
How do you overcome, though, maybe generational poverty, where let's go back 3 generations, 4 generations, as a time when maybe all around Dublin City, not many people were well off, right? Yeah. And then for some, the next generation get better off, the education and so on, and then free education came along and the next generation get better again, and eventually this generation go to college and expect to go to college. But there are others, and that process did not happen for them. So if you're today and you're never going to go to college or have no
Yeah.
expectation of going to college, how do you kind of redress the imbalance that has been caused by that generational lack of opportunity?
I think it's. I mean, I do think obviously there's income. You have to equalize income more, but the real key is education. I mean, we say we've got free education, but I always remember meeting this young girl who was 13, who had a mother who had an addiction and a brother who had ADHD, and she used to manage all her mother's and brother's thing. And she came into me one day, and the mother says, "Congratulations, she just got 13 honours in the junior cert." And I said, "That's fantastic. Are you going to go on to the leaving?" And I said, "And what are you going to do in college?" So I was delighted. And she said, "What do you mean?" She says, "I'm leaving school next week." Just
Yeah.
they literally, you need to get back. And I think it's almost starting at pre-education. Like over in England, they started these preschool system called Sure Start, because you grab children at an early age, get them established in education, support them. I mean, I come from a well-off area. I could get grinds for my kids. I can send my kids to schools I know they're going to do well. So even though there's free education, it's not an equal education system.
And no, but even if you do get the early start for children and then they go home into a chaotic parental situation or lack of parental situation, whether it's addiction or poverty or whatever it is, the kind of support that, well-to-do kids just take for granted. It's going to be
Yeah.
there. There's going to be books in the corner. There's going to be a bedtime story. There's going to be opportunity to do all sorts of things.
I think. I mean, I think we need to increase services and we need to strengthen communities. I mean, I do think. I mean, Imelda talks about the strength of the Liberties community, and I see that in the inner city. There's a strong community, and I do think the things that have really helped communities, like in North Inner City community, you can see all these community interventions, all these group work, youth work projects, all these projects for older people, and projects to help people who are using drugs, and a lot of them supported and initiated in the community. So, I mean, there's no simple solution to it, Pat. Like, I'm not saying that
No.
anything's going to cure it overnight, but if these are the types of things we need to do to address it, and we need to, and I do think we need to invest in communities and in education at an early age. I mean, I one of my aims is to try and get doctors to work in inner city, and what I prefer is to get doctors who come from the inner city, who will then go back and work in the inner city because they'll understand their community. So I think, yeah, and
But you're demanding maybe of those doctors a loyalty to that community, which they may well be delighted to have escaped. In the same way as you have an Irish well-to-do doctor who's happy to go to Australia or Dubai or Boston, Massachusetts, rather than serve a community that might need him or her at home.
I set up a GP training scheme to train GPs to work into private communities, and everyone said, "Don't call it that because no one will apply." We have the highest rate of applications because young people do want to work in there, and we've a number of people who did originate in these communities working. So I think actually young doctors want to make a difference and they want to get into these areas. So actually we can get them there.
Finally, we have not yet been scourged by fentanyl. We have obviously some prescription use and misuse, but nothing on the scale of OxyContin in the United States. I mean, how long can we avoid that kind of scourge, which is even worse than heroin?
I think, yeah, like we always remember we hadn't got crack cocaine and we says, "Oh, hopefully we'll avoid it." And it came. I do think that fentanyl is really dangerous. With heroin, you have to inject it to overdose. Fentanyl, you've just got to smoke it and overdose. And I think you're going to find a huge increase in deaths. And we already have over one death a day from drug overdose. As I said, I think if it was rich kids were dying, that we would have had much more interventions and much more supports. I mean, as part of decriminalisation, the other thing we need is health supports, and not just in Dublin. We need them around the country. I see many people coming up to Dublin, becoming homeless so they can access drug treatment. They should have their health services locally, and we need to improve those local services.
A final point is about the people who peddle this stuff. You depend on the courts, and there'll be these guys, because they make a fortune, can afford the best lawyers and so on. What needs to be done, to teach them a lesson?
Well, I mean, I think the justice system still needs to work against them. So,
But does it need to work in a more draconian way? The judiciary will always resist mandatory sentencing.
yes,
But
yeah.
do we need for people who peddle death?
Yeah, my own belief is the people on the lower ends of peddling debt, like the dealers who are right on the street, they're probably one frame up, and some of them, I think we need to, not maybe not draconian, but the people right at the top, absolutely, But the people down there, I do think we need to try and get them back and reintegrate them as well, though they still should face the law. But maybe when they go into into prison, there needs to be some sort of system to try and rehabilitate them.
Dr. Austin O'Carroll, a GP specialising in drug and homeless services, thank you very much for joining us.